welcome to this live debate, the impact of COVID-19 on telecoms. Just to say, this is the first in a series of live debates we'll be running during the spring and summer on a whole range of issues around the future of telecoms. Topics include the enterprise opportunity, whether telecoms operators can make the most of that, the future of innovation, the role of IoT and whether IoT can live up to its promise, and how to leverage public cloud and not be consumed by it. So some pretty meaty themes for us to talk about over the upcoming weeks and months. I'm delighted to have with me today three distinguished experts from the industry. Nick Willett, CEO of TM Forum, Craig Wigginton, Deloitte Global Telecom Leader, and Herbert Blum, Global Head of Telecoms Practice at Bain. Good afternoon, everybody. In terms of how we will be conducting proceedings, we have about an hour. We won't go beyond the hour. So the format's going to be a panel discussion. So no slides. We're getting straight down into the nitty-gritty of the issues of the day. I have some questions to put to Nick, Craig, and Herbert. In terms of your participation, this is an interactive session. So I think you've already seen the note about the Q&A box. If you have questions for any of the panelists, then please use the Q&A box. But also, if you'd like to use the Q&A box just to comment on things that operators you think are doing in the current situation, things that I can share with other attendees, just to try and make this a more interactive debate. So I think on that note, we shall move on. And I'd like to just open proceedings today. And Nick, maybe I can ask you first. How do you feel telecoms operators are responding to the pandemic?
Well, thanks, Mark, and welcome to everybody on the call. I'd just like to start by saying, obviously, this is a difficult subject for all of us to address because it's one that's coming with a lot of pain and upset around the world. So our thoughts are with everybody today who's affected by what's happening. I think in terms of the response from the global service providers, the industry's responded remarkably well, in my view. If we look at what's happened over pretty much overnight, we've seen 6 months of demand that's materialized pretty much overnight. In some countries, lockdowns have been announced with just hours' notice, and that's led to a huge spike in demand on networks. So generally, when we look across the TM Forum's global membership, we can see between developed and developing nations quite an interesting split, 40 to 50% traffic growth in most developed countries, voice in anywhere from 30 to 100% growth, mobile data growing between around 15, 20% average, in some cases a lot more. In some cases a lot less, and then obviously roaming down substantially as well. So this is an unprecedented situation on one hand, where it's, I think, being felt most keenly in terms of keeping everybody connected has been in developing countries where there's so much more dependency on mobile, and that mobile infrastructure is often built for a distributed people working at home very, very occasionally, more typically migrating to cities and so on. So it's leading to some performance challenges there. But nonetheless, when we look at how the industry is responding, networks are running. You have to bear in mind that networks are built around key holidays, and typically we're running well below those kind of peak numbers. And of course, as an industry, we're used to double-digit growth, so it's not unusual for us to experience this kind of impact. What I think the industry should be very proud of is the really strong consumer focus and customer experience focus that's been kept through this time. So the consumer's been very much in the spotlight in the press, but there's also been really impressive stories in terms of how service providers are helping enterprise customers who've had to stand up virtual call centers overnight, having to deal with unprecedented security demands. We've got governments, such as here in the UK, who are now using these networks to actually conduct business fully remotely. So when you bear in mind that we're having to support that demand, keep the customer in the spotlight, put in place special measures for vulnerable groups and special types of customers, and at the same time, as an industry, move tens of thousands of our own staff to work from home, and cope with unprecedented demand. I think the response has been phenomenal. It's only been possible thanks to a lot of collaboration in the industry. So collaboration with vendor partners, a lot of supply chain issues to be overcome, unique kinds of collaboration coming to the foreground. So collaboration with companies like Netflix and Disney to reduce quality of streaming, to keep the networks running, even collaboration with regulators, freeing up spectrum and temporary spectrum licenses coming into play. So that's all been, I think, recognized by the media, by politicians, by leaders, huge appreciation. And it's really good actually to see an industry that's getting quite proud of what it's doing and the role that we're playing, keeping the world connected and keeping our economy moving in these challenging times.
Thanks, Nick. Craig, anything to add?
Yeah, Mark, I was just going to add, and Nick, you summarized it very, very well. I mean, I look at this as everybody's understanding the importance of critical infrastructure right now, right? Broadband and wireless are what's keeping this world moving right now. And there's nothing more important than keeping things moving, right? We've got enough of a slowdown, but we'd be nowhere without what, again, before this crisis was kind of looked at as a little bit of a sleepy industry. It's nice to get that resurgence back again. And, you know, to go from, you know, a moderate level of service to every day is New Year's Eve or Mother's Day, right? Two really iconic, you know, times when we'd see a surge in volume. It's now 24/7. And the telcos going out there and doubling down on their commitments for building out further infrastructure, building out rural, right? You know, getting access to capital, which, you know, cash is king in all times, but especially in today's environment. Their focus on first responders around the globe and their focus around digital education, making more content available, making more, you know, access available is definitely things that are going for the greater good as well.
Thanks, Craig. And Herbert, networks currently are holding up well. Can we be confident that, assuming that there's still a lot of lockdown in 3 months' time, can we be confident that networks will still be performing well?
They should. So we should recognize that in particular, our access networks don't have sort of structurally the same levels of redundancy instrumented in that we see in metro and core networks, where basically everything today has redundancy path through a mesh architecture. So we may see that if typical maintenance things will start breaking down here and there, and we can't fix them as quickly, as we continue to see a bandwidth creep that may here and there that we start seeing nodes to congest, that will cause, you know, a requirement for major upgrades, and we just can't react as quickly. But when you sort of take account of how the telcos have responded and how the networks have held up, I think they should feel extraordinary about the test that was thrown at them through this crisis. And I would say the one sort of add, while the telcos have passed this test with flying colors, and they should feel tremendous because they approached this not only with a calling to meet the bandwidth challenge, but with a higher sense of calling and duty for the society at large. There is another test coming as we start to emerge out of this crisis. How much of what they have given can they actually give back without looking to be the old, you know, telco that is charging me every month? And it will be interesting to see as the telcos are required to recuperate some of the easements on the top line they have given, and how to handle this. This will be a very difficult and test and will require a lot of sensible dealing with our customers.
Thanks, Herbert. So thank you. So we have some poll questions for you, the audience. So Ali, if you want to just bring the first poll question up on the screen. Okay, so the question we have for you all out there, and please participate, it'll help us to give a representative number of answers. Will the reputation or brand of the telecoms industry be enhanced because of how it's responded to COVID-19? Please choose the answer. The first one, yes, telecoms industry has demonstrated its value, has responded well. Secondly, too early to say. Or thirdly, no, telecoms has done no more or no less than what would be expected. So if you could vote now, please. So just while you think about that, looking at some of the comments and questions coming in, to what extent will the rollout of 5G deployment and growth in IoT, and how will that then drive edge computing requirements that will affect cloud bandwidth capability? I guess my answer to that would be if IoT was creating bandwidth issues, it'd be a nice problem to have. But my impression is it's not really happening at the moment. Okay, so let's take a look at the answers, Ali. So interestingly, so I have to say I was expecting a higher yes. Quite a few hedging their bets. Any responses or what you'd expected? Anyone?
Mark, I would have just said I would have expected more in the yes column as well. But look, we're in the early innings of this, right?
Yeah,
It's all unprecedented, so people are probably being a little bit conservative, and that is the nature of this industry too, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I just add to that. I think as Herbert was just saying, and Greg's just commented, it's a question of here in the moment, people are appreciative of it because this is the method through which you stay in touch with loved ones. Many of us can keep working. Unfortunately, that kind of gratitude quickly gets forgotten and can be replaced with anything from frustration that this level of service can't be maintained, or that the pricing perhaps that was given temporarily isn't permanent. I think it's a matter of can we hold on to that rather than how do people feel right now?
Interesting. Another question has come in asking panelists your view on the new normal and what it might be. I think Herbert actually, I'm not sure if Herbert or Craig touched on that and said it would be interesting to see how the industry reacts in terms of going back to old ways. My guess is too early to say.
It is a bit too early to say, but I would say that discussions that, if you sort of take account of the last 4 weeks, I would say that first half of those first 4 weeks, it was very much how to deal with the current situation. It was very much a act now mentality. But the telcos were very strong at standing up war rooms efforts. Crisis response was tremendous. And it's interesting, you have seen over the last 2 weeks a shift to that new normal thinking, sort of a plan now mentality. And there are clearly, the executives are clearly thinking about basically about two things. The one is how do we deal with our customers to whom we have given a lot of support, and where do we strike the right balance? Because they do see the opportunity to build brand equity and a deeper relationship with their customers. And the second opportunity that they see in particular on the consumer side is how this digital adoption that we have seen that was forced on everybody over the last 4 weeks, how much of that can we put in a bottle and use it as a new way of how we actually consume telecom services and deal with our customers.
Yeah, and the digital adoption kind of morphs into the virtualization as well, right? So how do we do more remotely? I mean, even if things get back to normal, which we're all hoping they do in the near term, there's going to be a ramp up, right? So, again, virtual support, virtual retail. So starting off with your own shop for telcos, how do they really help the customer get that experience real time? I mean, there's going to be handset upgrades needed, and we've seen the physical environment right now has slowed down with handsets. I think virtual is a good opportunity. So again, the kind of the short term, near term, long term, or respond, recover, thrive. These are all things that the telcos need to think through the different steps with their customers.
Yeah. I think this has put all kinds of digitizations on fast forward. I mean, even within the industry, the use of video in meetings has gone through the roof. It's now very much the new normal. So I think internally within the telco, this is going to fast forward a lot of digital efforts. Externally for customers, one of the things that we should perhaps call out is what we've said in a few short words of how quickly telcos have moved, call centers with thousands of people to work from home and engineering workforces of tens of thousands of work people to make this work. That's been a challenge in its own right. I think if you'd asked most telco executives back in January, could you do that if you had to, they wouldn't have believed the situation would ever come. but the industry's been able to do that. So I think there should be a lesson here for the industry in that when we put our minds to it, actually some remarkable things can be done.
Thanks, Nick. So a couple more comments coming through. Someone's asking a question about contact tracing. I know Craig wants to talk about that, so we'll hold that one. Another comment saying that if anyone was skeptical before about telcos needs to digitize, that skepticism has very rapidly disappeared. So I think we'll all agree with that. Okay, so let's move on. So there's two themes that I want us all to explore over the next 45 minutes. And the first one is about telecoms operators and society. And so our thinking is as follows. Is there a relationship between telecoms and society likely to change as a result of COVID-19? So I think we can say the value of robust, secure, affordable, high-speed broadband networks has never been as clearly demonstrated as it has been in recent weeks. They're enabling people to stay in touch with loved ones, to keep themselves entertained, enabling companies to carry on doing business. Now, for governments, enabling that sustained and continued investment in broadband networks and reach remote areas is going to be an absolute prerequisite as hopefully things start to improve, even if they, however slow or fast that may be. But does that mean that governments will want to play a deeper, more strategic role in the telecoms business than they do currently? And if they do, what might that involve? Might that mean less regulation, more regulation, a different type of regulation? So that's my opening statement, if you like. And I'm sure you'll have different takes on this. And maybe, Herbert, maybe I'll start with you, Herbert. So what are your thoughts in terms of how, I know this is speculation at this stage, but thoughts about how the relationship could change?
There will be changes. This crisis is so severe in its broad impact that it will absolutely leave a permanent footprint on our industry, and that is a function because societies in general will have a sort of review about how they can self-sustain themselves in a situation like this, how they can deal with such a crisis, no matter what it is. So there is going to be a resiliency thinking, and this will, for telecom and the communications network, that will be no different. I think it will be very difficult to say here's the 2-3 things that will happen on a nation state level. And I use the word nation state. I think we see much more nations taking a more assertive approach when it comes to the communications platforms going forward. While it's difficult to say what one nation will do versus another precisely, I think we will see across the board that all governments and society, the public more at large, will have a review of the relative weight of policy objectives. So pricing still will matter, that there's universal broadband everywhere will still matter. But I think we will see that resiliency, network resiliency, the ability to rely on networks no matter what, will come and rise to the top of one of the key considerations. And that will have I see 2 broad impacts. The one is a continuation, what we have seen on the supply chain side, even pre-crisis. I think it just reinforces some of those dynamics we have observed. And number 2 is we will see that governments will support policies that see increased investments, and not only investments in terms of fiber everywhere or HFC networks everywhere, fixed broadband or better 5G networks. No question that will happen, but I think there also will be a review. What will it take for the last mile to be even more resilient than it is? Do we really rely on a hub and spoke architecture, or will we introduce mesh architectures into our last mile like the RAN or fiber networks as well? So no question that this will have an impact. I think the way to think about it is that the mix of policy objectives will shift with resiliency coming to the rise.
So I know that within Europe, it's often said by telecoms operators that regulation tends to be more pro-consumer than pro-industry. Do we think that balance might shift? I don't know if anybody wants to pick that one up.
I would just say overall, I do think there will be a rebalancing, as Herbert just said. I'd be even more critical. I think governments and regulators around the globe and politicians, right, have been focused on beating the hell out of telcos just to get costs down. And that's been the main objective. I think you're going to find more of a balance. I think it's going to be more about ubiquitous coverage. I think it's going to be about closing this digital divide as well. And cost will still be an issue, as Herbert said, but I think that's going to become secondary to great coverage. And I think the regulators around the globe are going to have to figure out also how to accelerate some of this coverage. We talked about spectrum before, but how do you get the prices of spectrum down? Because they've gone through the roof. It's been kind of a treasury exercise of how to get government funding, right? But now you got to make that spectrum available, to all the CSPs out there. Maybe there's additional stimulus. We're starting to see some of that now around the globe, and I think that's going to be absolutely critical. And availability of spectrum, right? Not just cheaper, but available, because it's been a challenge in a lot of key areas, and that's what's holding up the process. And last but not least, I'd say it's a little bit also about streamlining rules and regulations for building out small cells, for laying fiber. I think you'll start seeing some telcos partner a little bit more on the core infrastructure as well.
Thanks. So, Nick, I'm going to bring you in, but first, can we just maybe take the next poll question? Because the next question looks at some of the possible approaches regulators might take to try and drive sustained investment in networks. So, Ali, could you bring up the next poll, please? Okay. This is a more complicated one, I'm afraid. So we're asking you to tick just 3 boxes. And so listed, you have 6 ways in which governments and regulators might implement in order to drive investment in high-speed networks. So the first one is what Craig was referring to, which was reviewing license and spectrum fees. Craig also referred to taking a more proactive approach in network sharing. The third one is relaxing competition rules to allow consolidation. So what I'm referring to here is that in many countries, even though operators have attempted to merge, competition authorities have denied them the right to come together. Fourthly, reducing red tape and planning to allow operators to accelerate the rollout of high-speed networks. I'm thinking there mostly, I guess, around 4G and 5G. The fifth one, probably the most controversial of the 6, but I thought I'd throw it in anyway, which is, should regulators break up incumbent telecoms operators into a network company on the one hand and a service company on the other, and seek greater state control of the network business? And lastly, introduce new universal broadband plans to incentivize existing telecoms operators to extend their networks into rural and remote areas. So just choose 3, please, and I hope the results will show which of those 6 options you would tend to favor. So I always hesitate to preempt these. I always tend to get these wrong, Nick, when I try and think which ones people go for. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut for a change. So
you don't want to influence the audience either, right?
Exactly. No leading the witness.
Exactly right. So we'll give you 10 more seconds. Okay, so let's take a look, Ali, at the answers. So I'm even having to scroll down here because there's so many answers. So it actually takes a while to consume this. So it seems as if the favored response is introducing universal broadband plans. 61%. It seems as if the answers aren't, the colors aren't, are the colors displaying right on your screens, guys?
Yeah, I think, 61% people saying, and that's just in top place on this universal broadband. And then it looks like pretty much a tie on spectrum fees, proactive network sharing, and reducing red tape.
Yeah, and so any thoughts on that, Nick? I mean,
I think as Herbert and Craig have mentioned, it's going to be a package of measures, whatever happens. So it's going to be a combination. And let's not forget that the situation in different markets around the world is also very different. What you need to improve coverage in the UK is very different from what you need to improve coverage in other countries. So I'm not particularly surprised by that kind of blend. I think the sentiment here that's important is twofold. One is we're going to see, we hope, and I'm very much aware it's the sort of beneficiary as an industry, leading this conversation right now, but I would expect to see a much greater awareness and appreciation and need for this to happen. So the governments were already in many cases on the brink of understanding the direct tie between the digital dividend and the level of digitalization of their society. There's some countries doing that very well. So I think we're on the brink of that. This may well be what pushes it over the edge. I think, though, we have to look at it not just from a network point of view. The network is only one piece of the puzzle here. Let's also look at, from a government point of view, critical infrastructure. I think this whole situation has highlighted, much as our healthcare systems and health workers around the world are doing amazing things, just how antiquated the supply chain management of many healthcare systems is. The monitoring, data management, and so on are all going to be areas under the spotlight. So I think to really answer this question, Mark, we have to think outside in from the government's point of view. Yes, for a regulator focused on connectivity, I hope we see the shift to universal broadband and better connectivity rather than just an obsession with price and trying to extract money from the industry. But I think we'll also see a very long tail of that into governments worrying about critical infrastructure for their nations and what's it going to take to digitize that.
Yeah, and Mark, if I just build on, Nick is raising a hugely important point. I'm very optimistic that governments around the globe will look to connectivity and say, at a minimum, this is a critical utility. It's a little bit of a rebirth of the utilitarian aspect of our policy aspect to this. So all governments will look to this and say it's a critical utility. But Nick is raising a really, really important point. The best governments, regardless if it's a developed or developing market, will look to connectivity and say it is one of the platforms that run our country. And it's not the only platform that run our country. And in fact, our society thrives on how the various platforms like healthcare, like manufacturing, all of these industries are platformizing themselves as we enter the platform economy. And those governments who realize that it's beyond just a critical utility and in fact permeates the fabric of our modern society, it's those that will actually thrive.
The challenge is that our government doesn't even know how to make Zoom work. So you're asking for a certain level of technological competence from the government, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, but it's not even about just the technical ability, right? It's just the knowledge and the understanding that the economic impact of this industry, right? Broadband drives everything. Even with 4G, we did a paper on the economic impact. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars of GDP growth. That gets people's attention, right? That gets the regulators' attention, the politicians' attention, and it helps balance out the other things that they're trying to do as well. But jobs are critical right now more than ever, and that's the name of the game.
And is there a quid pro quo here? So we are talking about potentially regulators easing certain rules about how telcos operate. In return, presumably, it's accelerating building of networks into rural remote areas. Are there any other quid pro quos here? Anything else? Any other ways in which telcos will need to work more closely with government?
I think, Mark, this should shake up the role of telco. So I think it's very easy in these discussions to just focus on network and connectivity to homes and allowing people to homework because that's what's perhaps on our minds right now. But if you look at that full path of accelerating digitization of the end user industries, of the critical industries, you have to think through what it takes to do that. And it's not just connectivity. Connectivity is one vital piece, but so are many other pieces of infrastructure, of capability, of skill sets, and so on. So as Craig says, I think we'll see huge investments in basically what you can look at as a level of resilience and self-sufficiency. Mm-hmm. And much as there's been a debate raging very actively around the world for the last 12 months, well before this, in terms of local and national policy versus global policy. And we certainly believe that globalization is a good thing and that we should remove borders. I think nonetheless, you will see most governments and countries and companies saying we needed to be better prepared for these situations. And we've realized just how dependent we are on, one shock in one place can slow us down. So I think that will lead to both digitization, better resilience, but also many years of planning for how we don't get caught in this situation again as an economy.
Okay. Craig, I know track and trace is something you wanted to mention here. What are your thoughts in terms of how telcos might be required, how they might get involved in contact tracing?
Yeah, so Mark, this is a complicated topic, right? I mean, it's probably a webcast in and of itself, but what's clear is for society and our lives to get back to normal, I think there's going to have to be an element of that. It's a sensitive topic around the globe, right? Some people have been able to force it in place in one way, shape, or form, but there's other countries that are very conservative when it comes to that because of consumer privacy, et cetera. So trying to find that balance of how can we manage through this? How can we help support society getting back to normal, without totally destroying the privacy that the ecosystem has built over the last few years? And it is a sensitive balance. I mean, we're talking about, there's a lot of different disparate things going on around the globe. You can read any news article. None of them have, in my view, been perfect solutions yet. I do think it's this ecosystem and this industry, though, that can help drive this through to be able to, again, accelerate the return to normalcy in the near term. So we're working on a few different things. There's a lot of ecosystem players. We've been working, talking with the TM Forum, as you know, about some of this as well. And I do think some of this is going to have to be put in place. You look at, South Korea came out with a paper, and it wasn't just on track and trace, but about how, ICT, so, telecom and technology was able to kind of drive the flattening of the curve there. So if you really want to geek out a little bit, pull up that paper on the internet. But there's a lot of good stuff out there, and we're confident that this industry as a backbone can help support the ability to get things back to normal much, much quicker.
Thanks, Craig. And before we move on to the next topic, there have been a few comments and questions coming in about 5G. And we can take the 5G discussion in any number of ways, but if we stick with 5G in the context of what does society want or need operators to do to build more robust networks, where does 5G sit in that? Does 5G sit as something which is an unnecessary diversion of attention, or is it essentially building the future broadband networks we'll all be relying on in a few years, or a bit of both? Anyone? Herbert?
Mark, I think it's both. 5G will have to come, whether we had this COVID crisis or not. We have to realize that our modern societies need, for digital, for IoT, for all of these end applications that we keep talking about, they will eventually come. It's only a matter of time. It's not a matter of if. For that, we need the very best networks that we can. And I think net, in balance will be a positive for telecom operators because they will see more support to build these 5G networks. Yeah, we can talk about what now the optimal timing is in terms of adoption, given that we have to deal with the current situation. But we should expect that governments will make it easier to provision 5G sites, which are so critical, probably the single biggest choke point right now in the deployment of 5G models. And once we have a very strong 5G network, then other parts of the economy can then build on what we keep terming a platform. what connectivity is effectively becoming. I would say that I think the one new factor that we may see in all of this due to this crisis, because of resiliency reviews, we may look at a quicker adoption on architectures that will see the RAN being more meshed, to see more redundancy paths for packets to travel if certain links go down, whether including on fixed networks, so more converged approaches. I think that is one of the new things, because we do not only need fast networks, we need them actually to have tremendous uptime no matter what happens.
Thanks, Herbert.
And I would just add on to that, Mark. Those are all great points. I was a little bit nervous when this crisis first happened that we'd see a slowdown in 5G. As I mentioned before, you started seeing carriers actually coming out saying they're going to accelerate 5G, government stimulus. But I think there's also the demand side of it as well. I mean, more virtualization. We talked about healthcare a little bit. We talked about education, right? Connected retail. Another element that I'm kind of intrigued with is, sports have just shut down around the globe. And you think about it, people are captive to their homes in a lot of places. Sports are a great outlet. How do we start with virtualized sports, right? And whether it's real true virtual sports, or if we just have them playing without the audiences, right? Either way, you're going to need a lot more robust connectivity around the globe. So I think that demand side is going to help draw a lot of this spend out as well.
Yeah. I agree with Herbert and Craig on this. I mean, I think we will see some short-term issues. There's challenges around some of the short-term standardization, some of the short-term supply chain issues, but every CTO I'm speaking to is staying the course or accelerating their plans on 5G, and I think the demand will come to meet that. And I think quite often in these 5G debates, people immediately go to 5G just means faster. Let's not forget 5G also means much better density of connections that can be maintained, and that goes hand in hand with the growth of IoT we expect, but also just the continuous demand on the network in certain locations. And if we compare that with a more balanced approach from governments to support this and wanting to accelerate their role in this, I think there'll be a positive upside here.
Thanks, Nick. So I've just found one comment here which leads us in nicely to the second of our discussion points, which is what telecoms operators need to do to protect their business. The comment actually is an interesting one, which is that we look at governments across the world which have propped up their banks with cash to help to keep businesses alive. They're now putting money into the tourism industry. I wonder if they'll put money into the telecoms industry. So that's an open question, an interesting one. So when we look at operators and what they need to do to protect their business, we're starting to see some Q1 results coming through. I think some came through before the weekend. A little bit too early to read too much into those results, I think. There's only just the very start of the lockdown affecting societies. But I think we're going to need to wait until, I guess, the end of July and the next quarter's results before we can truly see the impact of COVID on the telecom sector. But I think we can be fairly certain that non-payment of bills is going to be a big issue impacting telcos negatively. There may be some gentle upsides in terms of people upgrading their broadband plans. One comment came in on the Q&A saying their broadband demand was skyrocketing, which was interesting to hear and good to hear, I guess, telecoms operators. And I think that's all short term. I guess medium term, and Nick's touched on this a couple of times, when we think about digitization, we can be fairly certain that there's going to be an acceleration of digitization across the business and societal world in the next few years. And that's clearly an opportunity for telecoms to have a role in that digitization. So I've put a lot into that opening sort of comments, if you like. Craig, maybe I can just ask you first. I mean, in terms of the financial impact, we don't know yet, do we? But it would be foolish not to think it's going to be impacted in a negative way.
Yeah, so Mark, I think we talked about a lot of those factors earlier, right? You know, giving stuff away. You know, the telecoms have responded around the globe, right? That they have not taken advantage of this to gouge customers. It's just the opposite. They've actually been very lenient with customers, and we talked about that. And when are you going to be able to move away from that? It's one question, but I think everybody's saying, look, we got to get through this problem first, and then we'll figure it out. But you know, telcos have built some goodwill with their consumers and their enterprise customers. And how do you make sure you're maximizing that in the long run, right? I think there's a lot of people that are going to look at this as really telcos being a differentiator for the networks, for the connectivity, for everything they're offering out there. And it can be expanded, right? How do you continue, as I said before, better retail experience? There's been a lot of debate about that, right? Is it bricks and mortar? Is it, digitized? And I think you're going to find more of a balance going forward because people are going to get used to this more and more. And, and on the enterprise side, it's the same thing, right? The enterprises have kind of moved away from, the telcos somewhat. I think now they're going to say, look, having a telco giving us the managed network, them knowing infrastructure the best, that's where we're going to go because quality and service and connectivity, I think, will trump cost going forward, at least in the midterm after this crisis.
Thanks, Craig. Herbert, when we spoke last week about this, and you said something very interesting about what you called trigger points, and trigger points that would help telcos to decide how they need to act, how they need to react and to act. Can you share that with the audience today?
Yeah, so over the last 4 weeks, we have been working with a lot of senior executives around, after the very first set of crisis responses, what's next? Well, what are we looking at? And I think we always deal with uncertainty. It's not nothing new per se, but the degree of uncertainty is like nothing that the current generation of executives had to deal with, including in 2008. We just don't know where we will land in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months from now. And as that path is highly uncertain, yes, there's sort of two things that you ought to do. The one is don't have a high, medium, low and say the low is just a thing that will not happen. But let's think about the worst case scenario and make it really, really bad, how bad it could be. And then work backwards from there to do the second important thing. As I think about those various paths that are reasonable, what are the precise trigger points that I can observe firsthand out there that actually would let me judge that we are now going left versus right at any given time? And those very specific things can be, I would say, the biggest uncertainty mark on the revenue side for telcos is small and medium-sized businesses. We don't know what the degree of closure rates will be in the various economies and how many will shut down. And that's the exact thing you want to know, look for. If it's 40% of restaurants all of a sudden shutting down in a matter of 2 weeks, you're looking at a lot worse scenario versus it's a very gradual trickle, certain types of family restaurants versus chain restaurants. You need to understand what these first principle things are, and as you observe these, you will be well equipped to know what's in store for the next 3 months at any given point.
And just Herbert, just sticking with you, there's a question here about near-term investment decisions. What are the sorts of near-term investment decisions that could change based on these trigger points?
Yeah. So I think the big lever for the telcos is across the free cash flow spectrum is CapEx. Number one is the first one. Besides, and I'm not touching any sort of investor-related share buybacks, dividends. Those are obvious levers that you often would go after. But there is CapEx. We have discretion in CapEx to say certain growth CapEx we defer until we sort of see the light in the tunnel. You instead shift towards capacity CapEx and maintenance CapEx to deal with the surge in different parts of our network. But then eventually the big question here is, as we discussed on this call, no question that CapEx will continue to be at very high levels, and that's a good thing, as we need good networks across the countries. The question is, how much can the telcos now seize the opportunity and take these digital advancements, which in the discussions we've been having and seeing has been about 2 to 2.5 years of advancement of digital adoption. How much of those efficiency gains that causes can the telcos put into the bottle and reap those OpEx gains to continue to support, on the one hand, CapEx investments, but secondly, also specific declines that we will see, permanent declines in pockets of our revenue.
Okay, thanks, Herbert. Nick, I'm going to bring in the agile word. And my question to you is, based on what Craig and Herbert have said, it's more important than ever for you as a telco to be able to react to whatever the market throws at you. How well positioned do you feel telcos are today to react, and what can they do in the next 12 months to react faster?
A great question, Mark. Are telcos well positioned enough today? I can only answer that by saying an awful lot better than they were 2 years ago in most cases, but it's still a real patchwork quilt out there in terms of the challenges that exist. And as Herbert and Craig have both touched on, we are in just such unprecedented and unpredictable times. From an agility point of view, when we think about business agility, the work that's going on between TM Forum members is very much focused on how quickly can I as a business react to a new stimulus or new situation and pivot to my advantage. That was true 3 years ago when we started working very heavily on business agility. I think it's going to be more important now than ever because of that unpredictability. I think that's true when it comes to opportunities and challenges. So there'll be, for every challenge we've listed on this call, we're also listing out an opportunity out there. We believe a lot of those will exist around the digitization of customer businesses, particularly in the enterprise space. I think that actually will only accelerate. So what that means for a typical service provider is the time window for your own transformation and the time window for your customers' transformation, I would estimate, just got cut in half. So many people in the industry are talking about the 5G growth and 5G society, which is sort of a shorthand for more general digitization industry 4.0. That was being talked about on a 10-year horizon. I think that could be cut as aggressively down to a 5-year horizon. Very hard to predict at this point. What that means in terms of our business agility, which is of course linked to people, processes and systems, is that we now need to very aggressively, more aggressively than ever, work through some of the legacy challenges. I know some operators are finding, even in this current crisis, the pressure operationally on them due to legacy systems is coming in all kinds of ways, even just legacy knowledge that you need in your business. So many carriers who are approaching a retirement cliff in a few years and worried about the knowledge that would walk out the door, that's been brought home even more acutely than ever right now. So in order to address that, I think we have to take a very different approach when it comes to, yes, the systems that run our business, but perhaps the conundrum that's facing most of the executives we work with in the TM Forum, which is having embraced newer ways of working, having embraced newer operational structures, having embraced newer technology, what is it that unlocks the ability to innovate? And we believe a lot of that is linked to the ability to partner, the ability to work with other people, and the ability to think very differently through problems. I think this current crisis has shown us an industry can respond to those, but it's only come about in a moment of dire or desperation. So I think the process we've been on, the journey we've been on as an industry of transformation for the last 4 or 5 years in terms of our overall agility, the fruit should be coming to bear, but it's clear that there also needs to be a broader business transformation that happens. And that's what a lot of our members are focusing on in the TM Forum.
So what does that mean in practice? Does it mean making decisions about things that you've talked about for 1, 2, 3 years and said it's a good thing? Is it saying we're going to do that now and we're going to simplify decision making across our organization? It seems to me that every telco knows what they need to and what they will do, but it's the timing that they can't get right. It's not happening quickly enough. So what will make things change?
I think we have to get out of the mindset that this is something you can procure. You can't procure agility. You can't go out and buy a system that's just going to make you more agile, in quotes. So what needs to happen is an end-to-end rationalization. There's so much complexity in many of our businesses today that has to be stripped out. That's as much about a cultural change end-to-end as it is about departmental or organizational structural changes. And it's as much about those processes being simplified and our ways of working being simplified. So nothing new, you might say. These are all topics we talked about for some time, but I think they're becoming acutely important. But anybody who thinks they're going to go into this and get this ability to pivot to the kind of opportunities Herbert was highlighting just by buying a new bit of software or hiring a new set of people, I think is going to be in for a nasty surprise.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nick.
And Mark, I think it's like anything in life too. It's just a balance, right? Prioritization, right? You've got a lot going on in a telco environment, and do you build out a network or do you do your internal systems? And you need to focus on both, right? Yeah. So it's a matter of just upping the prioritization for your digital platforms.
That's great. So there's a great question coming, we won't tackle now, but maybe for a future date. Will regulators revisit net neutrality rules? That's a great question, which I haven't thought about yet. So I think we'll take a look at that one. Another really nice question, which leads us on to the next poll. So the question here, B2C market appears to have good tailwinds because people generally need to get connected. What do you see as the prospects for B2B with business entities only open up gradually? So on that note, Ali, third and last poll question, please.
And Mark, maybe just one comment as the poll's coming up here too. You know, what we're seeing on the enterprise side is the same thing, right? They know they need to migrate towards more next gen systems and networks out there. And in fact, a recent poll that we did, 9 out of 10 IT executives, and it was just in the US, and we're going to do this globally, but they've committed to moving to advanced wireless networks in really the next year. So 9 out of 10 is pretty significant. Not sure how much COVID is going to impact that, but it's still a staggering number. So you think about it with the CSP lens on, you know, that's a huge opportunity.
So Craig, what do you mean there by advanced? Are you talking about 5G or more broad?
5G or Wi-Fi 6, right? Really stepping up your wireless networks.
Okay. So this poll question, it's a simple choice that we're forcing you to take in terms of where operators, with the context of the global pandemic, where should telecoms operators refocus their business? So the choice is 1, towards a consumer market, more connectivity, more faster networks, or secondly, focus on the B2B opportunity. So let's take a look at your answers. Okay, thanks, Ali. Okay, so interesting. So 2/3, 1/3. So that's quite an interesting split. Herbert?
So I agree. I may take note as a panelist, I'm not allowed to vote, so I'm not totally subject to having to choose one side. I do believe it's a bit of a both, but I agree with the responses that on the B2B side, things got a little bit more exciting because of this. I think on the consumer, maybe to address this quickly, because I said both, it is very much, as we mentioned here before, it is a digitization story. The touch points, and people all of a sudden are comfortable, people in their 50 and 60 demographics, paying bills on their phone, which they just wouldn't have done before. And so putting that, I say it one more time, into the bottle would be a great thing. On B2B, it is much more a virtualization story versus a digitization story. And the work from home.
Can I stop you? What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Talk us through.
Yeah, the notion that we are working with distributed architecture, whether it's the application, whether it's the connectivity layer, all things that sort of represent the enterprise stack can be distributed now. And I think that is a really, really important advance that we have made over the last 4 weeks, because a lot of conservative enterprise CTIOs were looking at the world very cautiously. I may not put everything into the cloud. We actually just witnessed that these virtualized architectures have been tremendously resilient and high performing and kept employee workforces really, really productive. And so it's right now a window of opportunity for telcos to get in on this and capitalize, and don't let it just get with other ecosystem players.
Okay.
Yeah, Mark, I would just say that, again, there's much, in my view, much more upside on the enterprise side, right? I think finally we're going to see IoT and, connected things starting to take off big time over the next year or two. And again, I think this whole COVID environment can accelerate some of that.
Yeah, the one thing I'd just add into that, Mark, I think, and I see some comments coming in that are sort of between the two actually, which is the demand for B2B good home connectivity and ability for people to work from home, I think is also going to be there. So I think we talk about a next normal or a new normal. Working from home will become a much more widespread, regular thing. But just look at the effort a lot of big companies, particularly in financial services, had to run. Those who had a bit of advance notice were running test days where they were, for over 3 weeks, sending people to work from home just to see if their networks could cope with it. You don't want to be doing that. You may not have that amount of notice to respond to this. So I think B2B, but focused on a home environment, be that from a security, high bandwidth perspective, is going to be an interesting hybrid of these two as well.
Thanks. So Nick, Craig, and Herbert. Craig, you're right. We could have had 2 or 3 hours discussing this. We had an hour, but maybe we should reconvene. But thank you so much for your thoughts. To all of you out there, hope you got a lot from this. I say thank you again to the 3 of you. And as I say, this is the first of many live debates we'll be running over the next 2 to 3 months, and we look forward to welcoming you to those. And thank you for your time, and we shall hopefully reconvene soon. So thanks again. And thanks for your participation as well. So the comments coming in were great. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but they added real value to it. Enjoy the rest of your day.